Hello and welcome to our channel. In this video we'll discuss about the human brain, and in this video basically we'll discuss about the first part of the human brain, that is the anatomy of the cerebrum. And the basic topics which we will cover in this video are: what is the anatomical location and the structures of the cerebrum? What are the internal structures, that is you'll talk about the cerebral cortex. Then we will talk about what are the sulcus and the gyrus of the cerebrum. After that we'll discuss about how many lobes does a cerebrum have. So basically we'll discuss about the 4 lobes of the cerebrum. And at last we'll discuss about the blood supply to the cerebrum and what are the functions of the cerebrum. So these are the main topics which we will cover in this video. So let's start with today's video, that is anatomy of the cerebrum. So as we all know that cerebrum itself contains the major lobes of the brain and is responsible for receiving and giving meaning to information from the sense organs as well as controlling the body. The cerebrum doesn't make up the entire brain. However, cerebellum and the brainstem sit below the cerebrum and they work alongside it to control the voluntary actions in the body. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and is located superiorly and interiorly in relation to the brainstem. It consists of 2 cerebral hemispheres, left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, which is separated by the falx cerebralis, or you can say falx cerebri, of the dura mater. And embryologically, the cerebrum is divided from the prosencephalon. And cerebrum is also called as telencephalon. Now next we'll talk about what is the anatomical position and the location and the structures of the cerebrum. So let's talk about the anatomical position of the cerebrum. So cerebrum is located within the bony cranium and it extends from the frontal bone anteriorly to the occipital bone posteriorly. And within the skull, the cerebrum fills the anterior and the medial cranial fossas and is located above the tentorial cerebelli and inferior posteriorly. So this is the exact anatomical location of the cerebrum in the human brain, in the human body. So this was all about the anatomical location of the cerebrum in the human brain and the human body. Now next we'll talk about the structures, that what are the internal structures and what are the external structures of the cerebrum. So first of all we'll talk about the internal structures, or you can say here we are talking about the cerebral cortex. So cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the cerebrum and it's gray matter. In human, this gray matter has an uneven surface with many folds and ridges which are called as gyri and valleys, or you can say simply folds, are also called as sulcus, which helps increases the surface area of the cerebral cortex. And the cerebrum is also composed of 2 different types of tissues, that is gray matter and white matter. So as you can see here on the screen, this one is gray matter. So first of all we talk about the gray matter and how it helps in the formation of cerebrum. So gray matter forms the surface of each cerebral hemisphere, which is known as cerebral cortex, and it is associated with processing and cognition. Now you can see here this is white matter. Now let's talk about it. What is the role of white matter in forming cerebrum? So white matter forms the bulk of the deeper part of the brain and it consists of glial cells. and myelinated axons that connects the various gray matter areas. So this was all about the internal structures of the cerebrum. Now next we'll talk about what are the external structures of the cerebrum. So externally, the cerebrum has a highly convoluted appearance. It consists of sulcus. You can see here, these are the sulcus, or you can say groups or depressions. And the gyri, as you can see here on the screen, these are the gyri, or you can say ridges or elevations. And it is divided into two anatomically symmetrical hemispheres by the longitudinal fissures. And the major sulcus that runs in the median sagittal plane. It has a falx cerebri, a fold of the dura mater, which descends vertically to fill this fissure. And the two cerebral hemispheres are connected by a white matter structure, which is called as corpus callosum. You can see here on the screen, this is corpus callosum. Now next we will talk about what are the main sulcus and the gyrus of the cerebrum. So first of all, we talk about the main sulcus or the sulci of the cerebrum. So basically, cerebrum has three sulcus and it has three gyrus. So first of all, we'll talk about the sulcus. That is, three sulcus it has, that is central sulcus, lateral sulcus and lunate sulcus. You can see here, this is central sulcus and this is lateral sulcus, and lunate sulcus is not here on the screen because it is present on the posterior aspect, which will not be visible. Actually, it is located on the occipital cortex, in the occipital side of the brain, of the cerebrum. Now let's talk about the sulcus in a brief manner. So first of all, we'll talk about the central sulcus. So central sulcus groups separating the frontal and the parietal lobes. And we'll also discuss about the lobes of the cerebrum very soon. Now lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus groups separating the frontal and the parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. And the third sulcus, that is lunate sulcus, this group located in the occipital cortex, as I have told you earlier. So this was all about the three sulci of the cerebrum, that is central sulcus, lateral sulcus and lunate sulcus. Now next we'll talk about the main gyrus or the gyri of the cerebrum. So basically it has three gyrus, or you can say gyri. That is, you can see here on the screen very clearly this blue one. This is precentral gyrus, and this yellow one is postcentral gyrus, and this greenish colored is superior temporal gyrus. Now one by one we'll talk about them. So first of all, we'll talk about the precentral gyrus. So this ridge directly anterior to the central sulcus and location of the primary motor cortex. Second gyrus is postcentral gyrus. This ridge directly posterior to the central sulcus and location of the primary somatosensory cortex. And the last gyrus is superior temporal gyrus. Ridge located inferior to the lateral sulcus, which is responsible for the reception and processing of the sound. So this was all about the main sulcus. Now next we'll talk about, one by one we'll talk about them. So as you can see here on the screen, parietal lobe, frontal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. So let's talk about the lobes of the cerebrum. So the cerebral cortex is classified into 4 lobes according to the name of the corresponding cranial bones that approximately overlies each part. Each lobe contains various cortical association areas where information from different modalities are collated for processing. And together, these areas function to give us a meaningful perceptual interpretations and experience of our surrounding environment. Now let's talk about the first lobe of the cerebrum, that is frontal lobe. As you can see here, this is the bigger one, that is a frontal lobe. Let's talk about it. Frontal lobe is located beneath the frontal bone of the calvaria and is the most anterior region of the cerebrum. It is separated from the parietal lobe posteriorly by the central sulcus and from the temporal lobe inferior posteriorly by lateral sulcus. And the association areas of the frontal lobe are responsible for higher intellect, personality, mood, social conduct, and language. And this is the dominant hemisphere side only. This was all about the frontal lobe. Now the parietal lobe. This yellow one you can see here on the screen. This is parietal lobe. Now let's talk about it. So the parietal lobe is found below the parietal bone of the calvaria and between the frontal lobe anteriorly and the occipital lobe posteriorly, from which it is separated by the central sulcus and parieto-occipital sulcus respectively. It sits superiorly in relation to the temporal bone, being separated by the lateral sulcus. Its cortical associations are contributed to the control of language and calculation of the dominant hemisphere side and visuospatial functions. So this was all about the parietal lobe. Now the next lobe, you can see here this greenish one, this is temporal lobe. Now let's talk about it. So the temporal lobe sits beneath the temporal bone of the calvaria and inferior to the frontal and the parietal lobes, from which it is separated by the lateral sulcus. And the cortical association areas of the temporal lobe are accountable for memory and language. This include hearing, as it is the location of the primary auditory cortex. Very important. Now the next and the last lobe, this pinkish one here on the screen, this is occipital lobe. Let's talk about it. The occipital lobe is the most posterior part of the cerebrum, which is situated below the occipital bone of the calvarium. Its inferior aspect rests upon the tentorium cerebelli, which segregates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Cerebellum is another part of the brain, which we will talk about in another video. And the parieto-occipital sulcus separate the occipital lobe from the parietal and the temporal lobe anteriorly. The primary visual cortex is located within the occipital lobe and hence its cortical association area is responsible for vision. So this was all about the lobes of the cerebrum. So basically cerebrum has 4 lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal lobe. Now next we'll discuss about the vasculature, that what is the blood supply to the cerebrum can be simply classified into 3 distinct pair arterial branches. You can see here on the screen this yellowish one. First of all, this is anterior cerebral arteries on the lateral brain and the medial brain, and this red one is middle cerebral arteries, and this bluish one is posterior cerebral arteries. Now let's talk about them in brief. So first of all, anterior cerebral arteries, branches of the internal carotid arteries supplying the anterior-medial aspect of the cerebrum. Second, middle cerebral arteries, continuation of the internal carotid arteries and supplying most of the lateral portion of the cerebrum. And the third one is posterior cerebral arteries, branches of the basilar arteries and supplying both the medial and the lateral side of the cerebrum posteriorly. Now let's talk about the venous drainage. So venous drainage of the brain cerebrum is via a network of small cerebral veins, and these vessels empty into the dural venous sinuses, that is endothelial lined spaces between the outer and the inner layer of the dura mater, brain to the cerebrum. Now the last part, that is what are the functions of the cerebrum, we will discuss in a very brief manner. So the cerebrum, which is the front of the brain, is composed of the right and the left hemisphere, as we have earlier talked about, which are joined by the corpus callosum, and the functions of the cerebrum include initiation of the movement, coordination of the movement, temperature, touch, vision, hearing, judgment, reasoning, problem solving, emotions, and learning. The cerebrum itself houses the 4 major lobes we have already discussed about, and each lobe has its own set of functions. Now here we will discuss about the functions of the cerebrum according to its lobe. That what is the exact function of each lobe. So although the cerebrum as a whole controls numerous functions of the body, and this is mainly due to the function of each individual lobe and the interplay between them. In general, the cerebrum controls all voluntary actions, and it is also the control center for sensory processing, emotional control, motor control, personality, learning, problem solving, language and speech, visual information, cognition and the higher thought, imagination, creativity, and musical interpretations, receiving and interpreting much of the physical world around the body. The sections below which details which lobe control which processes. So first of all, let's talk about the frontal lobe. It controls speech, behavior and personality, emotions, body movement, intelligence, and self-awareness. Now second lobe, parietal lobe. It controls language and the symbol use, visual perceptions, sense of touch, pressure and pain, giving meaning to signals from other sensory information. Third lobe, temporal lobe. Let's see what it controls. It controls memory, hearing, understanding language, organization and patterns. Now the last, that is the occipital lobe. It controls light, color, movement and some kind of orientations. An insular lobe controls homeostasis, compassion and empathy. So these are the main functions of the cerebrum according to each area, or you can say the each lobe. Structures of the cerebrum. We have discussed about the gyrus and the sulcus of the cerebrum. Then we have discussed about the vasculature, that what is the blood supply to the cerebrum. We have also discussed about the venous drainage. And at last we have discussed about the various functions of the cerebrum. So that's all. That's all for today. See you guys in our next video. Till then, stay connected with us for more videos like this. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below. And yes, thanks for watching our video. See you guys in the next video with the second part of the brain, that is cerebellum.